Network Entertainment.
Many of us are caught unaware of its purpose and function because we were led to believe that vulnerability was a weakness. It probably wasn't even said in those exact words, but that seemed to be the overarching idea. Stop crying. You're making a scene. Oh, you'll get over it. Nasa utak mo lang yan. You're making it up. Just pray, and it'll go away. Don't be sad na, ha? Depressed? Bakit ka depressed? I think if you turn the whole vulnerability as a weakness myth on its head, you'll realize that the reason why it was believed to be this weak ideal is because it was something not many understood. And what happens when you're put in a position to try to make sense of something you don't understand? It makes you feel uncomfortable. Okay, so you're uncomfortable opening up to others. Is it because you were taught that being vulnerable was a weakness? One of the scenes I remember watching from Shrek, yes, I know we're going to reference Shrek in this last episode, is the one where Shrek and Donkey are walking through a sunflower field, and Shrek says, "You know, there's more to ogres than people think." And then he proceeds to explain how ogres are like onions because onions have layers. If you replace ogres with people, then the same is also true. People carry within themselves a number of layers. That number depending on the many faces or layers that they choose to wear in different occasions. Some layers can be influenced by external factors, how you are with your parents, how you act with your close friends, how you behave with your colleagues at work. And then there are layers to you that never really see the light of day, or that only you allow yourself to see. There's a layer that wants to quit their desk job and try a more creative pursuit. There's a layer that feels like they're left out of the friend group because they just don't have time to hang out. There's a layer that feels like nothing they ever do will be good enough for their parents. There's a layer that pretends that everything's okay with their partner when something's actually been bothering them. There's a layer that is just filled to the brim with everything they have to do, and they're running on fumes and out of time. But we don't know how to peel back on those layers, do we? Let alone show someone just what layers we've been carrying or hiding or withholding all this time. Sometimes when you're at a tipping point, you'll have no choice but to air them out. But instead of losing control on how it comes out or when, you might consider beating it to the punch and lead with vulnerability instead. If you've never heard of Dr. Brené Brown, then you probably haven't come across one of the greatest TED Talks of all time. I would call her the mother of the study of vulnerability. The queen of Daring Greatly, which, by the way, is also the title of one of her books, Daring Greatly. At the time of this recording, her TED Talk entitled The Power of Vulnerability stands at 21 million views. The video was posted 13 years ago back in 2011, and I think that was the first time vulnerability was talked about in depth, but with such resonance and candor on a huge platform with a global reach that people were actually paying attention. We needed vulnerability to connect and reconnect with others. As social beings, we have an innate desire for connection. Now, in her second most viral TED Talk, which was called Listening to Shame, Brown defines vulnerability as emotional risk, exposure, uncertainty, and something that fuels our daily lives. And yet, many of us are caught unaware of its purpose and function because we were led to believe that vulnerability was a weakness. It probably wasn't even said in those exact words, but that seemed to be the overarching idea. Stop crying. You're making a scene. Oh, you'll get over it. Nasa utak mo lang yan. You're making it up. Just pray and it'll go away. Don't be sad na, ha? Depressed? Bakit ka depressed? I think if you turn the whole vulnerability as a weakness myth on its head, you'll realize that the reason why it was believed to be this weak ideal is because it was something not many understood. And what happens when you're put in a position to try to make sense of something you don't understand? It makes you feel uncomfortable, awkward. Why? Because you don't know your way around it, what to say, what to do. In other words, it was something you didn't know or weren't taught how to navigate. And that's no fault of your own. For some, they grew up in households where they were criticized for showing big emotions, like with Achilles in one of my coaching calls. For others, they grew up in a family that was familiar with conflict, but not so much repair, ergo everything was swept under the rug. Maybe you grew up with caregivers who expected you to take over the family business or become a doctor or lawyer. Or maybe you were just expected to suck it all up because God forbid you cry and make yourself look weak. Now, before I continue, I want to make something absolutely clear. If you were raised in any of those environments, I'm sorry that happened to you. And I'm also not telling you to point blame at your caregivers for not knowing any better and not giving you an emotionally safe childhood. When I think about my childhood and some of the memories with my parents that stuck with me because I was scared, neglected, ashamed, all I can say is they did the best they could with what they knew at the time. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's true for the most part. And I'm not gonna lie, it took me a while to actually get there. Hating and blaming your caregivers won't change what happened when you were younger. It's a part of you now, whether you like it or not, and all you can do is move forward and maybe do better. Because how they raised us was probably how their parents raised them, and it can go farther back too. They didn't know about the repercussions of their patterns or behavior, or that their patterns or behavior were possibly influenced by their own caregivers. And here's the thing, if you have boomer parents, psychology, therapy, mental health, empathy, vulnerability, self-awareness, all that sounds foreign to them. And they might not even believe or understand its importance to you, no matter how hard you try to convince them. It's at this point where you decide if, after convincing them or trying to convince them and nothing is working and they don't validate how it is that you're feeling, that this is where you decide if you should set a boundary to honor your needs and maintain the relationship at a distance. There's a lot of questionable things that we learned growing up. And I know that there are some things you're questioning right now, things you want to unlearn, because you're suddenly realizing that, one, whatever strategies you learned in your childhood aren't working in your adult relationships and friendships. And two, you can't live a fully authentic life if you aren't being authentic in how you feel within yourself. However, there's a huge caveat to vulnerability. And maybe it seems like I'm advocating it on the premise that being vulnerable will result in a favorable outcome. I'm going to tell you right now that won't always happen. People won't understand, some won't believe you, others will gaslight you.
Hi, I'm Joelle, and I'm back. Did you miss me? I wouldn't call this a season 2, but rather just another era with more lessons, realizations, and thoughts from all the overthinking. And it's not just gonna be me this time. We'll have special guests, other POVs, para mas marami pa tayong masagot na paano kungs ng buhay to hopefully help you find the answers you're looking for. Tara, this is Joelle's podcast, Paano Kung.
And of course, you'll be like, Nikki, I don't want to go through that again. I was rejected, I was hurt, I was invalidated, and I felt unheard, and it was painful. Yeah, and I hear you. But you stood up for yourself. You showed up in a way your younger self would feel safe around. You weren't compliant, you were brave. And if they don't understand, if they can't empathize what you shared with them, then why would you want to be around people like that anyway? Vulnerability doesn't exist for the purpose to be liked or accepted or loved in return. It exists for nothing more than to give you permission to be true to yourself. You don't take the emotional risk because you know the odds are in your favor. You lean into vulnerability no matter the outcome because it's what feels right for you. It's very easy to make the mistake in thinking that vulnerability only revolves around sharing your feelings and someone's impact on you, but we actually perform vulnerable acts in other ways too. So one of the most commonly overlooked vulnerable acts is checking in with yourself. It's funny because you don't necessarily require any other audience but yourself, but most people have yet to learn the self-awareness and sometimes discomfort of what checking in means. You might have come across terms like meditation, body scan, taking a pause, somatic therapy. Those are practices that allow you to go inward and just observe. Is there a sensation, a pain, a discomfort, or tension that you feel somewhere in your body right now? What are you feeling at this moment? Can you name the emotions? What's on your mind? What are the current thoughts running through your head? When you start checking in with yourself, you become more aware of your current state of being and how that could influence the way you interact with others, personally and professionally, or even just casually too, with a stranger that you just met. You're also able to hold yourself accountable if you react too harshly about some small thing at work, on the way to work, or at home. This doesn't mean that you get a free pass because you're in a bad mood. So, I understand that, asking these questions about yourself and kind of going inward still sounds so woo-woo. I know. And it still feels kind of awkward for me to do and to lead as a relationship coach. But that's also the same thing that we have to challenge ourselves into feeling, into being comfortable with, because we weren't taught how to really feel our emotions or even name our emotions. And so if you're able to actually do that, you have a much better relationship with your body, and you begin to notice things in the way that your body responds to certain situations when you feel activated or triggered, or when you're just relaxed and calm. So the next vulnerable act, obviously, is, one that's being vulnerable in relationships. And yet a lot of people can also get stuck here. It's only natural for us to have wants and needs when we're with a partner, or even just to sustain a relationship with someone we're close to. But if we don't bring it up because we're afraid of how they might respond to it or what they might think of us, then we start to grow resentful of them. It's just like that question I asked in an earlier episode. Do you want to build a bridge or create a rift? You can't deepen a connection if you don't give people, your partner, friends, your family, permission to enter your world. How you see things, how you feel, what you think, why you are the way you are. To be loved fully, means to share even the parts of yourself you're afraid to show. Then there's also vulnerability in pursuing your career. Asking for a raise or negotiating a contract. God, talk about that imposter syndrome telling you, who do you think you are? And convincing you to sit down and say nothing. How about quitting your job and going full-time on starting your business? Or choosing to become a chef or a baker when your parents wanted you to become a doctor? When it concerns major paths that would dictate your life's trajectory in the long run, of course it takes vulnerability to get real with yourself and think about the life you want to live and what you want to do with it. So, talking about those 3 areas in your life in which you show vulnerability, you can't say that it doesn't play a role in your life or that you've never had a moment of emotional risk, uncertainty, and exposure that scared the shit out of you. But you said the thing or did the thing anyway. I'm sure you can think of at least one example. So a few months ago, I went on a few coaching calls for training, and they all revealed something about me that I thought was something I had already been doing well. So what was it? It was my ability to be vulnerable with others. Huh? Me? I am vulnerable. I share my experiences with people. I've reflected on them so much that I'm open to having my life story be somewhat of a case study or a cautionary tale to improve someone else's life. I don't hesitate to share what I've been through and what I've learned through them. But I was coached by 3 different people, and they all said the same thing. I needed to be more vulnerable. At first, I really didn't understand. And then came the light bulb moment. I realized that I'd been thinking about vulnerability all wrong, or that I had only gotten half of it down pat. I had limited my understanding of vulnerability to sharing my experiences that happened a long time ago, which I feel pretty comfortable talking about now. But vulnerability spans not just the past, but also the present moment. What I mean is, I realized from my coaching that I was actually not as open to sharing my feelings while in a relationship or while dating someone. And that made a lot of sense. I actually kept a lot to myself. If I felt uncomfortable, I shoved it down. If I was upset, I shoved it down. If I felt lonely, I shoved it down. If I wanted to see them, I shoved it down. And the reason why I shoved it all down was because I was scared that I would push them away if I brought those up. That I would be too much, too needy, too difficult. It was a culmination of being a people pleaser and an anxious attacher. So I just suffered in silence and hoped and prayed that it would all work out. But it didn't, obviously. And if you're stuck in that place where I was too, let me ask you this. How does holding back, stifling yourself, staying silent, benefit you in the relationship? If it's to keep things in a good place, quote unquote, then are you really in a good place if that's the price you have to pay? So, following those calls, I tried to be more vulnerable in the present moment. Earlier this year, I started being more open with this guy I was dating. I would express when I was upset or if I needed something. And while it felt like I was doing the right thing, I still felt dismissed when he would just reply with one-liners. There was also more insecure attachment than connection with him, so eventually it did not work out. And that's okay. Because again, you're not being vulnerable for a specific outcome anyway. Now, I am in a relationship, and I think I'm the most vulnerable I've ever been, which still scares me sometimes, not gonna lie. Because in this relationship, we started out being open and honest in talking about anything that comes up, which, inevitably you become more open to share other things, specifically present and pertinent things. And sometimes for me, it still feels uncomfortable internally to open up, but I don't really hesitate as much anymore because externally, between me and him, it feels safe to do so. And I think that's a point that's worth highlighting. It might not get easier because there's always going to be a bit of anxiety or fear at play, but you do get better at being vulnerable, expressing your needs and emotions over time. For people who never felt safe, were afraid to be judged or criticized, or didn't learn how to be vulnerable with others growing up, it can be so daunting to make that attempt. You're thinking about what to say, how to say it, changing words and switching them around to make sure what you're saying doesn't come off as arrogant or too demanding. Then you're thinking about your audience and how they'll receive it. One moment being optimistic and saying, yeah, they're reasonable and understanding. They'll see where I'm coming from. To the next moment being pessimistic and thinking, they're not going to get it. They're too fixed in their ways. They were born in a different time, or they're just going to gaslight me. The truth is, no matter how prepared you think you are in being vulnerable, you're never going to know the outcome until you actually do it. So if you trip on your words and feel awkward or scared to be vulnerable, own it. Why not? Here's an example. What I'm about to tell you makes me feel awkward to admit. This makes me feel uneasy to share with you. This is really hard for me to say. That's showing vulnerability. You're admitting the difficulty, anxiety, hesitation to express what you need to express. You're naming the emotion to get ahead of it and to get through the conversation, which is a conversation that obviously needs to be had. So vulnerability is weakness? No. As Dr. Brené Brown found in her years of research, vulnerability is actually the most accurate measurement of courage. If vulnerability is weakness, then why do we feel relief when we finally share something that's been bothering us? If vulnerability is weakness, then why do we have a more intimate relationship with our partner after sharing how we feel about each other? If vulnerability is weakness, then why do we feel more liberated when we decide to live more authentically? If vulnerability is weakness, why does it somehow make us feel a stronger sense of self and self-worth? Everything that I've talked about on this podcast is centered on vulnerability. Loving yourself and accepting everything about you. Believing you deserve good things instead of self-sabotaging. Navigating through relationship conflict. Dating with intention and telling them what you want. Expressing your needs, setting boundaries. Correcting your maladaptive patterns. Taking accountability. Wanting to be a better partner. That takes an insane amount of vulnerability and therefore an insane amount of courage. And you wouldn't be here listening to this podcast if you didn't feel like there was something about you that you could improve on. That's also vulnerability. You deserve to live the life you want, to love someone without fear or shame, and be loved by someone who makes you feel safe. And in case you needed to hear it, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not too needy. You're not too clingy. You're not too difficult. Trust me, you're good enough.
The opinions of podcast creators, hosts, and guests are not necessarily reflective of the official stance of the Pod Network Entertainment, its hosts, or other network programs. The content created by the people behind the podcast is personal and not meant to harm any religion, ethnicity, group, organization, company, or individual.